Capcom has a lot of fighting games in their history, and while Street Fighter is the undisputed number one now and probably always will be, and Marvel vs. Capcom is a massive fan favourite that everyone loves, right behind them is the topic of today's video. A series that, despite only really having 3 games, technically 5 but that's a whole other thing, and a few re-releases with the last collection being a decade ago, and the last new game being over 25 years ago, has retained a strong and passionate fan base. And that series is of course Capcom's fighting game love letter to classic monsters, Darkstalkers. So after a quarter century in the shadows being relegated to costumes and crossovers, it's time for them to stand in the spotlight once again as we put together a 4th Darkstalkers game. To be totally honest, I've been on a little bit of a Darkstalkers kick after recording the Arcade Assault episode on it, despite Pyron's best efforts being one of the most infuriating bosses I've ever seen, and after watching Forgy's Arcade's Build Roster episode on the same topic, I kind of felt inspired to throw my metaphorical hat into the ring and give it a go myself. I don't know if I'll end up doing more of these or if it'll be a one and done, we'll see how it goes, but let's get right on into it and start putting this roster together. Now, how big is this roster going to be? Who's going to be in the game from the previous entries, and who's getting cut? Morrigan, she's the face of the franchise. Whenever Darkstalkers is represented, she's right there front and centre. Obviously, she is staying. Jeddah, the main antagonist of Vampire Savior and one of the 3 leaders of the Houses of Makai, staying. Dimitri, the actual vampire in Darkstalkers, he is also staying. Felicia, kind of a secondary mascot to the series, she's staying. Lord Raptor, he's a cool punk rock zombie man, he's staying. Xianko, a Jiangshi and she's also really popular, staying. John Talbane, Kung Fu werewolf man, that's a cool concept, he's staying. Lilith, may I interest you in Morrigan 2? Yes, she technically becomes one with Morrigan at the end of Vampire Savior, but we can shenanigans around that. She's staying. Rikuo, the strangely attractive fishman as the cartoon loves to keep reminding you. He's staying. Pyron, cool flame elemental alien thing, the original boss of the series. He's staying. Sasquatch, he's a wacky Sasquatch guy, and also one of the only Canadian fighting game characters. He's staying. QB, Jeddah's right hand and a weird bee lady. She's staying. Anakaris, he's our mummy rep and has some really strange moves. He's staying. Bishamon, he's a cool possessed samurai. He's staying. Victor von Gurdenheim, I don't know why I said him as his full name, but he's a big Frankenstein grappler. He's staying. Huitzel, he has an interesting robot design, reminds me a little bit of Arahabaki in SMT. He's the original sub-boss. He's staying. BB Hood, or Boletta, Little Red Riding Hood if she was a sadistic demon hunter and was packing heat at all times. She's staying. And lastly Donovan, a Dampier demon hunter. He's a key part of the plot. He's staying. The original 18 Darkstalkers are all staying. They cover a good range of playstyles and classic monster archetypes, and honestly it would just feel wrong cutting any of them, with a few of them being too popular to ignore, and it would just be weird if almost everyone was here and then 1 or 2 were gone. Accounting for DLC releases and everything, I settled on 36 as the final number. Originally I'd planned on 24 base characters with 12 DLC ones, then went to 28 and 8, but with everyone coming back and needing new fighters as well, I ended up splitting the difference and going with 36, 26 launch characters, and 10 more as DLC. I know that the odds of this happening are borderline non-existent if a new Darkstalkers is ever a thing, because realistically I can't imagine they'd give it a base roster that's larger than that of Street Fighter. But now let's get into the real meat of this roster, the new additions, starting with... Shadow, not that one, was a secret fighter in Vampire Savior, played by pressing select on the random character option 5 times before you picked your character. It was a weird case where you would start as one character with the Shadow possessing them, then when you won that match, the Shadow would leave the character you were playing and make them a grayed out husk, and then possess the character that you just beat. It doesn't have an arcade mode ending, but a different credits roll with a different theme that shows grayed out versions of everyone's versus screen portraits, implying that it may have just consumed all of the Darkstalkers that it fought. In Darkstalkers 4, I'd want to give Shadow, again, not that one, a reason to truly exist beyond being a kind of just creepy secret character, because up to now he has no real explained lore or backstory or anything. He's just kind of there as a secret. Maybe it's a malefic amalgamation of the souls that had been collected in the fetus of God in Vampire Savior, now out to seek revenge on Jeddah. This could force him to try to gather the other Darkstalkers against it as part of the story, or maybe it just wants to consume anyone or anything that it can. For its fighting style, I think maybe we can take a page from Seth in Street Fighter, or Double in Skullgirls, and make an amalgamation character who takes various moves from other characters. Although I think if it has a teleport, or even kind of like Glacius's Puddle Punch in Killer Instinct, I think those could also be pretty solid moves for it. Its win animation could be the same as the one from Vampire Savior, or maybe it just pulls its opponent into the shadowy mass, and then takes their form on the win screen. This would work because its original win screen was just ellipses before popping up with the portrait of the character that you just beat. I think Shadow has a lot of potential to be really interesting, and I would love to see where they could go with this character, but Shadow wasn't the only secret fighter in Vampire Savior. Just like Shadow, Marionette was also a secret fighter in Vampire Savior, played by pressing the select button on the random character option 7 times before you picked your character. And while Shadow would possess your opponent after you won a match, Marionette would make every single fight into a mirror match. Just like with Shadow, she doesn't have an arcade mode ending, and her win screen is just ellipses, and then the silhouette of your next opponent. Continuing with her similarities to Shadow, she also doesn't really have any form of established backstory. The only thing I could find was a quote on the Capcom wiki that says, "It has said that an evil phantom, Shadow, made a young woman his slave, turning her into a puppet in order to fulfill his task." But there's no source listed to confirm this, and since neither character talks in Vampire Savior, I don't really know. However, I do kind of like this idea to give her some more character, a marionette being used by a cruel puppet master just to do awful things against her own will. I'm not 100% sure on how I would want her to play, but I would love for her to have really stilted animations and visibly be on strings. When she's defeated, she just collapses normally the first time before just getting yanked back up, and then the second time the strings get cut and she just drops. I'd have her arcade mode ending give her kind of a Pinocchio treatment, and becoming not only real, but a fairy with her own name, purpose, and autonomy. That way they can mostly carry her design forward into a new fairy character for Darkstalkers 5, and also give her a new rival, or enemy, in the form of a new marionette used for the same purposes by the Puppet Master as she was. These next two are long overdue for their story to be told fully, but in order for us to go forward, first we need to go back. Darkstalkers 2, Vampire Hunter, introduced Donovan, a Dhampir who hunts Darkstalkers and acts as the protector of an emotionless little girl named Anita. His ending in that game showing what happens when he loses control of his vampiric dark side. Anita finally shows emotion and cries as Donovan is consumed by his inner evil. It then jumps forward 10 years, showing Anita having grown up and now wondering if Donovan ever found peace, or if she would ever see him again, before cutting to Donovan surrounded by bodies and blood, with the story stating that he fights a desperate battle for his humanity against the darkness within him. He fights, but the night is long, and the darkness is patient. And that brings us to our next fighters, and a potential subtitle for the game. D is perhaps one of the most secret characters I've ever seen. He was only playable in a Japan-exclusive re-release collection of Darkstalkers games on the PS2. You can pick him in Vampire Savior, Vampire Hunter 2, or Vampire Savior 2, those two are the ones that I alluded to earlier, and by pressing select on the random character option 9 times before picking your character. In terms of practicality, he's Donovan, but basically as a boss character, and he almost looks like he has Donovan's head on Dimitri's body, because originally he was going to be an alternate playable version of Dimitri. And then after you beat Jeddah at the end of arcade mode, you get one final match with a now grown-up Anita, but the screen fades to white and goes to credits as soon as the fight starts. The credits then show Anita standing in a cemetery in the rain, with the heavy implication that she killed Dee in an act of mercy. But this story never gets fully explained or anything, and it's even debatable whether or not Donovan's Vampire Hunter ending is even canon, and that's where Darkstalkers 4 would come in, but I'll get to that soon. It is referenced in Teppen through a card called Destined Confrontation, but that's just about it. D would be pretty simple. He'd basically just be Donovan, only with some unique visuals and effects, along with a couple of new moves of his own. We wouldn't want to make one of them feel redundant because of the existence of the other. He would be balanced to be a playable fighter, but would also be super powerful when you fight him at the end of the arcade mode or the story mode as a boss. And that brings us neatly onto his counterpart. Anita would be the new protagonist for Darkstalkers 4. Other characters will have their own motivations for wanting to fight and defeat D, but Anita is different. After seeing what happened to Donovan, maybe she's had visions of his fate, and over the 10-year gap has dedicated herself to trying to save him, either by exercising the darkness within him, or by killing him, if that's what it takes. Despite this though, I don't think she would harbour any real resentment towards most of the cast. In terms of gameplay, I could envision her being kind of a zoner using her new Exorcist powers. Thematically, I think it makes a lot of sense, because since she has Exorcist powers, it stands to reason that she would be able to keep the Darkstalkers away. That, and maybe using her powers to throw things around, it could just be a little fun and call back to her one playable appearance in Marvel Superheroes. Maybe she could have a prayer or throw holy water down and create a blast in front of her, almost like Quan Chi's rune traps in MK9 and MKX. My only kind of hold up on getting Anita into the game is that her moves and design kind of require at least a degree of religious symbolism, but I think we can work around that. I've mentioned the story a little bit, and with this being the first brand new Darkstalkers game in 25 years, I think we can go back and tell the story again. And just for convenience, to make it easier to work around, I'm basing its approach on one of the most well-regarded fighting game story modes ever made. In fact, it's kind of the one that popularised them, that being Mortal Kombat 9, which retells the events of the first 3 games, while having a bit of its own at the start and at the end. So you have the story retold in a way to reintroduce the characters, set up who they all are, why they're here, and also this is a very easy way for me to justify having the entire old roster in here, while also being able to just slide in new characters as and when need be. We won't be doing a timeline reset like Mortal Kombat did, instead we'll have it as more of a kind of narrated flashback, but for the sake of convenience we can make some retcons here and there if need be. The first game's story, up to the defeat of Pyron, could be narrated by Dimitri, as he was likely the one to defeat Pyron in canon, before Anita then takes over the narration once she and Donovan are introduced. The Vampire Saviour section ending with her closing the book with a "and that's how we got where we are now," as she gets up and leaves the church. Or maybe she's confessing all of this to a priest or something, before she then leaves for the final chapter of the story. In Talbain's ending in Vampire Saviour, you learn that he's taking care of 2 young children. Maybe Anita is friends with them and can talk with Talbain about the possibility of saving Donovan. After all, Talbain learned to tame his inner beast after defeating Dark Talbain, who was a secret boss for him in Vampire Saviour, but would be the final fight of his story chapter here, and a Dark Talbain colour or costume would be unlocked for beating him. Similarly, I think we could use this same approach to include Oboro Bishamon in the game, because he's Bishamon when he's in full control and not being possessed by the sword and the armour. With Darkstalkers 4 being set 10 years later, maybe Oboro's new moves could just be implemented into the main moveset and make Oboro Bishamon an unlockable costume, just like with Dark Talbain. Also, if they want to give the story a sweeter, happier ending, they could, with Anita saving Donovan and getting his inner evil under control. That both saves Donovan so he could be in future games, and contains Dee in such a way that he could be excluded from future stories, but remain in the series as a malevolent presence. Much like how Ryu has to contain the Satsui no Hado to keep evil Ryu in check in Street Fighter. I would want Dee and Anita to be hidden, unlockable fighters that you get for playing the story mode. However, I do know from MK9 and MKX that locking characters behind finishing the story can cause issues at tournaments. So I'd propose a compromise where they're unlocked for single player and playing online for finishing the story, but available in local versus mode either from the start or just by putting in a code. That way, you're rewarded for playing through the story with more content, but people also don't need to turn up to a tournament and have to worry that their character just might not be available to play. With the game taking place 10 years later, I would like to believe that all of the characters get a slight redesign. Ideally, you could unlock all of their original looks by beating arcade mode with each fighter. Now that we've reintroduced the entire original roster, and fleshed out Anita, Dee, Marionette and Shadow for a roster of 22, this is where things open up a little bit, and I need to start getting a little bit creative as I think up some brand new Darkstalkers to round out this roster. With Dee taking over the story as the new main antagonist, he needs a new sub-boss or someone to hassle the heroes on their way to him, and that is where our next new fighter comes in. A stone gargoyle who watches over Dee's residence, so maybe we can post them up as the Watcher for Dimitri or Jeddah earlier in the story, and then Dee at the end, coming to life when Anita approaches. Plus, what is a spooky gothic mansion or castle without some gargoyles? For their gameplay, I want to take some inspiration from Firebrand's appearance in Marvel vs. Capcom, giving them a strong air game with some air grabs to give wall and ground bounces, but also give them a new design and backstory so we can make them into a Darkstalkers original fighter fitting the monster trope of the gargoyle. I wanted to include a bugbear character, because I thought having a giant teddy bear full of bugs could be a good fit for Darkstalker's silly, but kind of serious tone. I wanted his general character to be that of a misunderstood Darkstalker who just wants to be friends with people, but because of his appearance and the bugs, people are naturally kind of scared of him. I wanted his playstyle to be kind of that of a trap-based pressure character, using his bugs and poison, almost kind of like Fang was in Street Fighter V. But he was not a popular character by any means. In fact, he's probably one of the least popular characters in Street Fighter period, and honestly, I don't know if that's down to his design, his character, his playstyle, or some combination of it all, but I don't think I'd really be able to get this guy in here as DLC that would realistically sell, so I'm throwing him in the base roster just to give him a better chance. Although from what I've seen, Aki seems fairly well received in Street Fighter 6, so who knows. For some of his specials, he could have on quarter circle forward punches, he could leave a puddle of bugs that do damage over time, turning to grey health that can then be cashed out by a hit, similar to the poison. On quarter circle back punches, he could have a move that pulls the opponent towards him, that way it pulls them towards the traps and into range. And then on quarter circle forward kicks or as a DP on punches, he could have a claw slash as a potential combo starter, with the light going low, the medium going mid, and the heavy potentially being a cross-up overhead as he jumps over the opponent. I also just had this thought while recording this, but alternatively to the idea that I've just gone through, maybe he could play more like Kanra does in KI, where he could be kind of a trap zoner that has some grappling to him. When thinking of new potential characters, I had two in mind straight away that I would love to see, and one of them wasn't Onryo. A vengeful spirit born when someone died with a grudge, often born of jealousy, rage, or just plain hatred. Think of Sadako from The Ring, Kayako from The Grudge, or to give a fighting game example, Hisako from Killer Instinct. I don't have all of the details of their story planned out, but I would love for them to be a roaming Onryo, and have red spider lilies, a plant often associated with death, grow wherever she goes. I thought that an Onryo would be a really interesting addition to the Darkstalkers roster, but ultimately wasn't sure on how she would play. And looking for inspiration from other Onryo characters in fighting games, I realised my options were very few and far between. The only ones I knew of were Hisako from Killer Instinct, Noriko from the Black Art, and a character called Ella that I remembered seeing in Mugen years ago, and they all played very differently. I definitely wanted Hisako to be the main inspiration for their gameplay, with plenty of counters and surprise grabs, but KI and Darkstalkers are very different games in terms of how they would play. For our specials, I wanted to give her some counters that would allow her to gain some screen presence, apply pressure, and also resist being pressured. I did consider giving her an additional Vengeance meter that would increase as she took damage, like how Ultras would build in Street Fighter 4, only with it building, then if she hit a counter, it would heal her for a percentage of damage that was stored, but ultimately decided against this idea because it would add an additional meter that probably wasn't necessary, and also healing is both annoying to deal with and can be very hard to balance. Street Fighter 4 had enough of an issue when Elena had it as an Ultra. I had a couple of ideas for special moves. She could have on quarter circle back kicks a counter stance that would side switch and crumple the opponent on hit, basically Hisako's Vengeance move from KI, and on quarter circle back punches a simple thing to reflect projectiles back. Now, we have one spot left in our base roster, and it's for a character who is long overdue. Ruby Hart was the protagonist of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, the captain of a flying pirate ship, and most importantly, a confirmed character who was originally a cut Darkstalker. Her moveset is right there in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and could very easily be translated over. We could give her maybe a little bit of a redesign, make her even more piratey. Honestly, her flying ship just by itself is enough of an explanation as to how some of the Darkstalkers just happen to end up on the other side of the world. Maybe she jokes with some of them about how she's a fearsome pirate and not a taxi service. I don't really have much else to say on it. I think everyone would be really excited to see Ruby turn up. So we have our starting roster of 26 characters, and now we're going to bring that up to 36 with 2 seasons of DLC, with 5 characters each. You'll see a few new characters in here along with some familiar faces, so let's get right on into it, starting with Amingo has long been speculated but never officially confirmed to have been a cut Darkstalker, and just like Ruby Hart, he made his one and only playable appearance in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. So it's time for everyone's favourite Cactus Man to finally take root in a series and become a Darkstalker. He already has a moveset ready to go from his time in Marvel vs. Capcom, and everyone would be happy to see him. That, and if we add Ruby but leave Amingo out, people would probably be very mad, which is why he's going to be the first DLC character, and would be teased at the end of Ruby Hart's reveal trailer.
Everything is mine.
When I was thinking of ideas for new Darkstalkers, I had 2 come to mind straight away. This wasn't one of them, but the more I thought on the idea, the more I liked the idea of a Tengu fighter who would use the wind and their wings in battle for a kind of hit-and-run style. As such, I think we'd definitely be taking some inspiration from Rashid for some of his moves. In terms of his personality, I'd want him to be brash, cocky, and overconfident, but ultimately just want a good fight above everything else. For some of his specials, I would have him have a forward DP motion on kicks, basically just doing Kami's cannon spike. For a quarter circle back on kicks in the air, I would have him do a multi-hitting dive kick, with the EX version going into a launcher. Quarter circle back on punches, I would have do a wing beat, shooting a wind projectile along the ground that knocks the opponent back. This could be used at the end of combos to either push the opponent back and reset to neutral, or push them into the corner. And for his super, I'd have him grab the opponent and kick up a tornado, kick his talons into their back, and then just ride them down the tornado into the ground.
Now, impatient out into the war!
I wanted a rep for another long-dormant Capcom fighting franchise in here, so that meant I needed to find a more unconventional character from a dormant franchise. I had a couple of ideas before I eventually settled on the bizarre Jack from Power Stone. I had considered Kraken, but we already have a pirate in the game with Ruby Heart, and don't let his bandaged appearance fool you, he isn't a mummy. He doesn't overlap with an Icarus, although they could have a joking exchange about it. His walk in Power Stone was more of a crawl, so I think he would naturally low-profile some projectiles. Since his moveset in Power Stone is very limited though, we would need to think up some special moves for him, probably mostly based around his knives. Obviously, his super would involve his transformation from when he gets the Power Stones, either as an install or just for a super combo. While she's an established character within Darkstalkers lore as part of Xienko, she takes the form of the talisman on her head to keep her powers in control. With the time jump leaping us forward 10 years, we could say that Xienko can now fully control her powers properly without her help. This way, we can open up Mei Ling to be her own fighter, or we could just retcon her needing to be the talisman altogether if we have to. Her training as a Senjutsushi would make her kind of an exorcist, which would give a little bit of overlap with Anita. But while Anita's a zoner, I would make Mei Ling a hard rushdown character. Maybe she has a command grab where she applies a talisman to the opponent, and that talisman disables their specials. Or maybe it gives them no grey health when they get hit, or seals their super meter for a short amount of time. Almost kinda like a command grab version of Valentine's syringes and Skullgirls. Our final character for the first season of DLC needs to be quite a notable one, to maybe catch some people's attention if it hadn't already, but maybe not notable enough to potentially overshadow what would come in Season 2. Ghosts and Goblins was one of Capcom's more notable franchises back in the late 80s, early 90s. It may have fallen to the wayside over time, but the franchise's main man Arthur definitely knows a thing or two when it comes to fighting demons and monsters. Obviously, this would have to be a new version of Arthur, because even though we don't have a set date for when his games take place, it's very safe to assume that they were several hundred years ago. So the Arthur in this game will be one of his descendants who happens to just look very similar to him. And fortunately, we have a moveset all ready to go from his time in Marvel vs. Capcom, which no doubt means he would be an absolutely infuriating zoner to deal with. If we need a narrative reason for him to be here, maybe he's investigating something about the Demon King Astaroth and his ties to the Makai. That finishes off our first season of DLC, but we do have a few characters left, so let's keep rolling on into Season 2, starting with... Starting off Season 2, we have the final of the trio. Son was made for Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and it just wouldn't feel right for her to be left out, while we have Ruby Heart and Domingo both included. Just like the other two, she has a pre-established moveset from her time in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and while not being a classic monster per se, she does fill the role of the Sun Wukong stand-in. If Son doesn't make it in here, it's highly likely that we just never see her or her franchise again. Considering when she appeared in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, her series had already been dormant for a decade. For reference, Son hasn't had a new game since 1989. That predates even Street Fighter 2. Most of Capcom's biggest franchises weren't even concepts yet. So personally, I don't think there's any harm in letting Son live on through Darkstalkers. When I was thinking of new potential characters, I had two in mind straight away that I would love to see. One was Fionryo, and the other was a Dullahan. A creature from Irish folklore depicted as a headless rider on a black horse who often carries their own head and uses a human spine as a whip, which obviously gives them a good built-in weapon for some range. I'm still a little undecided on if I want them to be really serious and evil or just joking and funny though. Although it's Darkstalkers, they can probably be a good mix of both. For his specials, I wanted to get some of the mythos surrounding the Dullahan in, and honestly I couldn't really find any other Dullahan fighters to take reference from. The closest comparisons I could get were Misfortune in Skullgirls, which is a bit of a reach, and Elisa in Tekken since she can detach her head for some moves, but that's an even larger reach, although since he has a whip, maybe we could take some inspiration from Poison. A quarter circle forward on punches would use the spine whip, the light would be a quick low, the medium would be an anti-air, and the heavy would be a multi-hitting mid, but I would like to include with this move something where if you hold the button you got a slight variation. So if you hold the light, you kind of pull the leg for a side switch, if you hold the medium you pull your opponent in for a combo, and if you hold the heavy you do a grab into a slam for a ground bounce. I'm not sure about this move, but I thought it would be kind of funny for him to have a counter stance that would dodge depending on if you guessed if the attack was a light, a medium, or a heavy, with him countering in response and doing even more damage if it was an overhead, because of course, he doesn't have a head to target. I think that gives him a fun little bit of risk and reward, but also kind of plays a little bit into the wacky nature of Darkstalkers. Maybe the counter drops a basin of blood on his opponent for a stun. In the town of Doneraile, apologies to the Irish if I pronounced that wrong, it was said that it would visit the houses in succession, and whoever would answer the door would be splashed with a basin of blood. So I think that would be a fun little way to get that in there. I would have this move done by doing a quarter circle back on the various punch buttons. Even locked gates are said to burst open when a Dullahan approaches, so I wanted to give him a fast dash forward in order to clear through projectiles. I think I would have this as a charge back forward motion, but I think this could also just be a quarter circle forward on kicks. I would have the input for the super be a double quarter circle forward on all of the punch buttons. As for what the super itself would be, I would have him grab his opponent by the neck with his whip and run off on his horse, dragging his opponent behind him before throwing them into a tree. He absolutely needs to have an interaction with Lord Raptor where the head is the recipient of the Hell Dunk. Maybe it's a pre-match intro or something. And speaking of Lord Raptor, he might be a little bit interested in seeing this next character turn up. Ozarm is another lore character who's never been playable before. He has story ties to QB and Jeddah, being the one who took over the Doma land and house after he deceived Jeddah, leading to his temporary death. It was during this time that the Soul Bees, QB's race, almost went entirely extinct, so they both have very good reason to hate this guy. He's also the one who resurrected Lord Raptor and sent La Malta, the little Cyclops thing you see in a lot of his moves, to spy on him. Apparently Jeddah took Ozarm's soul and used it for the base of the Magigan in Vampire Savior. But Jeddah also says that Ozarm might have been absorbed into him, but he doesn't know when you confront him as Lord Raptor in arcade mode. But at the same time, this is a fighting game, we can shenanigans around it and retcon some stuff if we need to. In terms of his character, he fits the mold of a necromancer really well, and I know that it could be an issue in some markets, so his redesign would probably make him a bit less skeletal, but we can carry this forward into his gameplay by making him a summoner type character who would definitely be more on the zoning side. Our penultimate fighter is a little bit similar to QB in the sense that they're another insectoid fighter, only this one is going to be a spider lady. I was thinking that she would be a noble from the demon realm of Makai, just not quite on the level of Jeddah, Morrigan or Dimitri, and she would live in France in the human world to feast on humans. She would appear mostly humanoid with 4 spider legs coming out of her back when she assumes her more demonic form to fight. For her design, I'd want her to maintain being very visibly a noble, but also giving her a more seductive element that she would be using to draw in her unassuming prey, probably portraying that through how she would speak and general body language. I would also maintain a more humanoid form for her, because if she didn't, she'd be really out of place from the rest of the cast, and I don't want to lean too far into the whole spider demon thing, just for people with arachnophobia. For one of her specials, she would send a spider running across the floor that would then explode into webs, entangling the opponent. This would open them up for a combo as they struggle to get free. The EX version could stagger the spider's motion to catch people out a bit better. She could have a command grab with the light and medium ones using her spider legs to do some stabs before kicking the opponent away, with the heavy being an anti-air grab using a web to slam them to the ground, with the EX versions adding more hits. Although now that I think about it, I think the light and medium versions of this would basically just be Devora's throw from Mortal Kombat 11. So here we are. We have 35 out of our 36 characters, there's only one left, and you have to send your game out on a high. Which is why the final fighter for Darkstalkers 4 will be...
Who are you? Hey, you're gonna get yourself killed!
Don't crap yourself. He likes to kill demon things. Let him do his thing.
You hear what I said, you dumb one-armed son of a bitch? You're gonna die!
Cheer up, crew cut. You taking notes? All right. Time to kick some ass.
Nero is long overdue for an appearance in a fighting game, and while Dante may be the face of Devil May Cry, people would be definitely excited to see Nero. Just like his dear old Uncle Dante, his moveset is basically right there in the games he's from. Across DMC 4 and 5, he has no shortage of great moves to pull from. He'd have a good balance of up-close sword attacks, ranged gunshots, and using his Devil Bringer or Devil Breakers to pull his opponent in and open them up. His moveset is basically tailor-made for a versus game, so we might have to dial him back just a little, but I imagine he would play like a cross between Dante and Spencer in MVC. For Nero's gunshots with the blue rose, I'm actually going to take inspiration from a couple of other characters who appeared in Marvel vs. Capcom. Specifically Zero and Beautiful Joe, in the way that they can charge the Mega Buster or the Boomerang, which would fit very nicely for his charge shot. When it's fully charged, it could be a guard break. I'm a little less sure on how I would incorporate the Red Queen into his moveset. In DMC, he can rev the sword's engine to power it up, and if you have good enough timing, you can max act and fully rev it on each hit. For convenience purposes though, I think I would probably have to relegate this to his EX moves. For quarter circle forward on punches, he would just use streak, so he'd rush forward with a sword slash. The EX version would add a couple of spins and hits ending in a wall bounce. Quarter circle back on punches would do high roller, an upward swing that launches. Honestly, it could probably be a DP motion, but because of how you do it in Devil May Cry, I'd rather it be quarter circle back. For his reveal trailer, I'd make that Arthur, having been in the game for a while, is realising that this might be tougher than he thought and that he might need some help. So he's at a phone booth making a call, and either you hear nothing on the other side of the line until the reveal, or you just hear Nico saying that they'll be right there. To be totally honest, I wasn't sure who to put in here. Dante would be a great pick. Nero has definitely grown in popularity, but he's definitely not on the same level as Dante, and both of them have plenty of jokes that would fit the game's tone. Which is a sheer contrast to Virgil, who might be a bit too serious for the general tone. I also considered Lady and her walking arsenal, because honestly I think her interactions with BB Hood could be really interesting. I even considered Lucia from Devil May Cry 2, but ultimately went with Nero, because I think he would play off everyone really well, and he hasn't been in a fighting game before. And with that, we have our final roster for Darkstalkers 4, so with all of the DLC included, our 36 fighters are Morrigan, Jeddah, Dimitri, Felicia, Lord Raptor, Sienko, John Talbane, Lilith, Rikuo, Pyron, Sasquatch, QB, Anacharis, Bishamon, Victor, Huitzel or Phobos, BB Hood or Boletta, Donovan, Shadow, Marionette, D, Anita, a new Gargoyle character, a new Bugbear character, a new Onryo character, and Ruby Heart for the base roster. Then we would have a Mingo, a new Tengu character, Jack from Power Stone, Mei Ling, Arthur from Ghosts and Goblins, Sansan, a new Dullahan character, Ozom, a new Spider character, and finally Nero from Devil May Cry to round out the DLC seasons. To be totally honest, the Spider character was a late change because I originally had Nero as character 35, and because I already recorded the voiceover for it, just for fun, here's the cut for who was originally going to be the 36th character. The friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He needs no introduction, he doesn't even really need a justification as to why he's here. It's Spider-Man. He's already got a history in fighting games, he's got a moveset that can easily carry over from Marvel vs. Capcom, and his arcade mode ending could just be him catching up with Morrigan after all of these years. I think the odds of this happening are astronomically low, but imagine the buzz and groundswell of having Spider-Man pop up as the final character in Darkstalkers. It would cause immense hype because A, Darkstalkers suddenly has Spider-Man in it, and B, this crossover means that the door is wide open for the return of Marvel vs. Capcom, and then for future installments in the series, we could make an original Spider-Person who plays similarly, because I imagine Marvel, and specifically Disney, aren't the easiest people in the world to work with. Although in a world where we can't get Spider-Man into the game, we just make an original Spider character. I'm thinking she would be a cool Spider Lady, and put her into the DLC roster, and then make Nero the final character. In true fighting game fashion, Darkstalkers 4 would have a good few unlockable and downloadable costumes for each of the characters. Each returning character would be getting a redesign to establish that it's 10 years later, and their classic costumes will be unlocked as a reward for beating arcade mode with them. While a lot of the cast probably don't change a massive amount, the only one who would drastically change is BB Hood, because she would now be in her early 20s and not a kid like she was in Vampire Savior. Maybe she would be a secret agent or something now, but to be totally honest, I could equally believe Capcom saying that killing all those demons and Darkstalkers made her age slower or something, and just give her a new look based on a different fairy tale because Darkstalkers and demons would now be aware of her Little Red Riding Hood look. Morrigan's look with the white shirt and the red pants that she's had in a few appearances over the years would be unlockable. It's so beloved by fans of not just Darkstalkers but Capcom fighters in general, so I think the classic Morrigan sprite would have to be unlockable, it just has to be in there. Would it be fair? Probably, maybe not, but Street Fighter V was more than okay with having outfits that gave the user a potential advantage. They may have been banned from use in Capcom Pro Tour events, but that didn't stop people using them online. The first ones that come to mind for that for me being Gil's Pyron costume, and Armika's cheerleader outfit that covered her hands with the pom-poms. When Arthur gets added to the game, the Gargoyle fighter would get a costume based on Firebrand. And over the years, Street Fighter has gotten plenty of outfits based on Darkstalkers and other Capcom properties, so now we can let Darkstalkers have some fun with it. Morrigan could get some outfits based on some of Capcom's other leading ladies like Chun-Li, Jill, and Ada. Lilith could get ones based on Ashley or Jury. Sasquatch could get his own version of Blanca-chan. Pyron could get one based on Gil or Urian or someone. Dimitri could have one based on Wesker or Bison or Virgil or someone. You know, just a few little ideas to throw out there. Capcom has an entire series about fighting monsters, and Darkstalkers is a series full of monsters, so there's probably some Monster Hunter things that we could work in there. Admittedly, my personal knowledge of Monster Hunter is pretty minimal, but Street Fighter V got armor sets for a few characters, and Blanca got a full No Gigante set, so I'm pretty sure Darkstalkers could get something out of that. Now, this next one is just an idea, and it might be a bit of a controversial one, but no doubt there'd be people asking for it anyway if a new Darkstalkers got announced, so I thought it would be best if I mentioned it here. If you know Darkstalkers, then you're probably familiar with Dimitri's Midnight Bliss move. Basically, he transforms his opponent before biting them. He transforms male opponents into women and female opponents into various other looks. If we make it not turn the characters into anything weird, I have to specify this because historically it turned a couple of the characters into kids, I think if we're making models for every character being transformed, they could just release that as a costume pack and make one for the entire roster. I don't know all of the ins and outs of how making costumes for a fighting game would work, so I don't know how feasible an idea it would be, but people would buy it. People would definitely buy it. With that, we've built the roster, fleshed out some characters, laid out a bit of a story with some room to expand, introduced a few new fighters, made some DLC, and some alternate costumes. I'm pretty happy with what I've cooked up for Darkstalkers 4. My hope with some of the DLC guest characters is that it generates a bit of interest in some of their original franchises, and maybe gives Capcom at least a bit more confidence to maybe try to do something with them. The success of the new Darkstalkers could be the domino effect that opens up the door for a return for Power Stone, or rival schools, or so many of their other franchises. Okay, Akira being in Street Fighter V was probably the best shot at generating interest for a new rival schools, short of just making a new one, but you get what I'm saying. To be totally honest, when I initially started concepting this, I had two main monster types that I wanted to make into characters. Then as time went on, one of them ended up getting pushed off the main roster and into the DLC. Specifically, it was the Dullahan character, but I went with the Gargoyle, Onryu, and Bugbear for the base roster, so it just got pushed to the DLC. Then I ended up putting the Tengu in Season 1, so he ended up making it into the game a lot later than I initially intended for him. I also thought that it would be much easier to sell the Dullahan's general style compared to the Bugbear when it comes to DLC, while also not wanting to add two of the new characters into the base roster based on the folklore of the British Isles. The Bugbear originating in English folklore and the Dullahan in Irish, so Bugbear ended up getting Dullahan's spot in the base roster. I initially concepted the Gargoyle character because I wanted to add Firebrand to the game, but thought it would make more sense to make an original Darkstalker as opposed to another guest character. That, and I thought that including Firebrand in the base roster would probably just leave people asking where's Arthur, or just foreshadow him being included later. On top of that, I was missing a mid-boss, and a cool Gargoyle fighter seemed like a solid fit for that mold. While I was deciding on the DLC roster, I considered Mac the Knife before settling on Jack as representative for Power Stone. I decided against Mac the Knife because we already had a mummy in the form of Anacharus, and despite thinking that he could maybe play like Saddam does in Street Fighter, I thought it might be a little bit weird putting him into the game when Captain Commando isn't there. I say that, but also ended up picking Jack as my representative for Power Stone, so maybe that argument doesn't really hold up too well. While I was looking into some stuff once I'd already finished most of this video, I came across some stuff about an art contest that Capcom ran back when Darkstalkers Resurrection was coming out for people to design their own new Darkstalker. And after reading about the ideas people had, honestly, I would love to see a lot of these in a future game. There were a ton of fantastic concepts and ideas. I hope you liked this first episode of Figuring Out Fighters. I don't know if this is just going to be a one and done or if I'll make more of these. I definitely have a few ideas for potential future episodes if I do decide to make more, but we'll see how it goes. If I do, I might need to think of a better name for this going forward though. As always, thank you so much for watching, tell me what you think, feel free to leave a comment or click any of the buttons down below if you feel so inclined, and I'll hopefully see you for whatever it is I do next, whether it's on here or on my LP channel. Okay, thanks for watching, later.